'twas down the glen one Easter morn to a city fair o'day, when Ireland's lines of marching men in squadrons passed me by. No pipe did hum, and no battle drum was sounded straight and true, but the Angelus bell or the Liffey swell rang out in the foggy dew. Right proudly.
Welcome once again to Issue Forum, and this is Frank Avila, your host, and I have today, it's going to be a very interesting show, and it's a little different than our normal show, because a lot of times we talk about domestic issues, we interview this alderman or that alderman or something related to Chicago, and this is related to Chicago, but we've broadened the scope a little bit. It's both cultural, it relates to Chicago, but also international, specifically but not limited to Ireland, and I have Mary O'Sullivan and Chris Fogarty as my guests. Thank you very much for being on our show.
Thank you for having us.
I'm going to let them talk a little bit about themselves, but I just saw that Chris Fogarty is a civil engineer, and so is my father. So there is something we do have in common. And what's interesting is that Chris was kind of a reverse immigrant. He was born here on the south side of Chicago, went back to Ireland, and Mary was born in Ireland and came to Chicago.
Correct.
But both are in Chicago and been in Chicago for some time, and I think you're going to find this a very fascinating show, and I want you to watch. And no matter if you're not interested per se in Ireland, I know we have a large African-American population, don't turn that down. In fact, rip it out. That's how badly you should watch it, because we're going to talk about the FBI, we're going to talk about murder, and it's really fascinating stuff, and I hope you watch, and I hope you enjoy. But first, tell us a little bit about yourselves.
Well, we have an organisation called Friends of Irish Freedom, an organisation that was started in Ireland over 100 years ago, and it was to foster democracy in Ireland and to bring about an end to British rule there. And we operate under that organisation's name, and mostly now we just do media watch, and we've worked on getting several resolutions passed in City Hall. We worked for the Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4,
the Guildford 4, you mentioned that it was a very good movie. If you haven't seen it, it was with Daniel Day-Lewis, a number of other good actors. It's called In the Name of the Father.
Correct.
And
it was the framing of people for an atrocity that they didn't commit.
And also a very good movie soundtrack, if you like Irish music. And some of you may not know this, but Thin Lizzy, the gentleman was African-Irish, but Irish band Thin Lizzy, of course, U2, Sinead O'Connor, a great movie and great soundtrack. But go on. So tell us a little bit, very briefly, since you brought it up, who the Birmingham 6 were. Just tell us very briefly who they were.
Well, there were a group of 6 young fellows in England. There was a bombing campaign, bombing went off there, and they were picked up. They were Irish. They had nothing to do with it. They were Irish, and that was sufficient.
They were tortured into confessing. They spent 16 years in prison.
And
16 years in prison.
So did the Guildford 4.
Beaten and brutalized. One of them, Paddy Joe Hill, was out here a couple of years ago, and what happened to them is something like you hear out of Guantanamo these days.
And the Guildford 4 also, what people don't know is that in the United Kingdom, you do not have the same constitutional protections against torture, due process, as we hear in the United States.
Yes, in fact, Britain has been taken to the European Court for Human Rights for torture, and it was Europe's most often convicted state for torturing, official torture.
And most of their victims were Irish.
Every single one of their torture victims were Irish Republicans, or suspected Irish Republicans.
Okay. But in these cases, what's interesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, some of these young men had nothing to do with anything. There was people working in London who had the accident by birth of being Irish and Catholic.
Yes.
They weren't soldiers.
That's nothing.
Terrorists, freedom fighters, nothing.
That's right.
Nothing.
And that's the way it typically is. The connection between any given combat engagement and who serves time for it is almost random. There's almost no connection ever.
Now, you also talk about who the actual terrorists of the Anglo-Irish conflict are.
Yes.
And in the next show, we're talking about many of the historical aspects. Who are, in your opinions, the actual terrorists?
Well, you see, Mary and I never bothered. By the way, we're husband and wife. We met at Carpenter's Hall at 64th and Hall Street years ago, in 1957. but she likes her own name better, and that's why she goes by Mary
It's not
O'Sullivan.
better. I'm used to it.
To continue, so we don't give our opinions because everyone has an opinion, and nothing good happens if it's merely an exchange of opinion. But what we do is provide facts, and it is a fact that of the 173 children murdered during the Anglo-Irish conflict, the most recent one, all but 20 of them were murdered by British forces. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. The record is available.
Let's get that statistic again.
Of the 173 murders of children, 153 of them were murdered by British forces. On 20 of them, and those 20 are important, 20 were murdered by Irish Republican forces. And they can be condemned. They should be condemned for the murder of the 20. But the ratio is 8.5 to 1. The British are the terrorists, and yet they're the ones who denounce terrorism.
And this would be regular or SAS troops who were in
British
Northern
soldiers,
Ireland occupied?
yes, British soldiers, SAS, all kinds of spook agencies, and the murder gangs that they direct.
This you can find. Sorry, this you can find in the computer. It's www.irishterrorism.org.
No, terrorismireland.org.
Okay, give that website one more time.
www.terrorismireland.org.
Terrorismireland.org.
Right.
Now, you also mentioned other kind of thug agencies that they direct. And you saw the release of that gentleman, using the term loosely, called the Rat, and the Ulster Defense League, or the Ulster Defense Forces, Ian Paisley. Are these the type of agencies that you feel the British government were supporting?
I don't feel it. The record is quite clear on it. They were run by British spook agencies, MI5, MI6, the FRU Force Reserve Unit, and a couple of other oddly named ones. By the way, 2 of those units are now over in Iraq interrogating prisoners along with the Americans.
A fellow named Spicer is running
in fact, they just murdered one man under interrogation. And all the torturers have been recently, just a few days ago, were acquitted in a British court.
Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about you guys personally. There was a murder of a family, I believe known as the Langlert family.
Right.
It was a husband, a wife, and an unborn child, and they lived in Winnetka. And what year was that?
1991.
1991. So it was right after the fall of the Soviet Union,
Right.
In 1990. And this family's murdered, and shortly thereafter, Carol Maureen of now of Channel
Whatever, yeah.
NBC, Channel 5, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, I want to get this wrong. Also columnist with the Chicago Sun-Times, had a report that the murder of this family was linked to the IRA.
Correct.
Okay. And
I called her that night to ask why she would say such a thing.
now, why would you call her?
Because I knew it was false.
But you called her because you're involved in this Friends for Irish Freedom.
Indeed, indeed, yes, indeed. And if there's any activity here regarding the politics of freedom in Ireland, it would be completely, it's ludicrous to think that something would be going on in Winnetka that would be of any value whatever to democracy in Ireland. It just didn't happen. So I did reach her the next day, and she said that she had gotten her information from the FBI. And I said, did you verify it? She said, no. I said, how can you go public with important news like this without seeking verification first? She hung up on me.
Okay.
But later, the murderer was actually was revealed, and
Now, the murderer was convicted, is that correct?
he's serving life without possibility of parole in Pontiac, Illinois.
Okay, so the murderer of the Langlert family was eventually caught, tried, and convicted.
Yes.
And is serving life without parole.
Yes.
And it was when I say local boy, but it's somebody, a young man
Yes.
from Winnetka,
Correct.
apparently troubled,
Yes.
who committed this brutal murder.
Yes.
So it had nothing to do with the Irish Republican Army.
Absolutely nothing.
Okay. How did they try to tie you into the case?
The police from the North Shore came to our building on Lakeshore Drive and sat around hung around the lobby, telling the doorman and anyone else who would listen that a suspected murderer by the name of my name, Chris Fogarty, lived in the building. And they then came on another day at 6 o'clock in the morning, just before I was going out to work, to ask me some questions. And rather than leave them down there scandalizing our building, I said, come up and I'll give you some information that might steer you toward the truth, might steer you off this whole thing. And so they came, I gave them some information, and away they went. But they fabricated questions and answers, which they said they asked and I answered. And they have me quoting in quotation marks, saying something that only the murderer of everyone on earth, nobody possibly on earth could have had the information other than the murderer or the first investigating officers on the scene of the crime. And yet they attributed that to me, a complete fabrication. But they didn't arrest me yet because they're having trouble keeping the murderer covered up. They were all reporting to this FBI agent Buckley, who at the time was working for MI5 and continues to work for MI5.
Now, that's a very bold claim. You're claiming that an FBI agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation of our United States, Federal Bureau of Investigation, are you saying that he is working with the knowledge of the United States, or he is a double agent? Because it would violate FBI rules and U.S. law. It would be treasonous to be an agent of another country's security apparatus.
Correct. He is a traitor to the United States. He denied in federal court in Chicago later, when they tried to frame us on a second set of charges. He denied in federal court that he was working for MI5, but later in a court in Dublin, we saw him with his handlers in completely familiar proximity. And what's more, a criminal that he hired here in Chicago and brought to Ireland to commit similar crimes in Ireland. He also got that criminal on the MI5 payroll. So the criminal was.
Have you informed the federal government of this?
Oh yes, through Janet Reno, and when I gave her the superficial evidence of these crimes, it took her about 4 months to reply. And she said that she had brought my allegations to the FBI, that they had investigated themselves and found themselves innocent.
Well, but this is a very bold claim that an American law enforcement is a member of MI5 or MI6.
Yes.
And just for those in our viewing audience, MI5, MI6 would be equivalent of the United States CIA or the Israeli Mossad or Shin Bet. If you like James Bond movies, as I do, James Bond was a member of MI6.
Yeah, that's their CIA. But it just happens to have been the equivalent of their FBI, MI5, who was here in Chicago.
So MI5 is their FBI, MI6 is their international arm.
Correct.
Okay. And it's your allegation that you say is backed up with fact that Mr. Buckley, Patrick Ed Buckley,
correct,
is an agent or an asset of MI5.
Correct.
Okay. Now, you said he brought a criminal over to Ireland.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
It was to frame an Irish Republican for the Omagh bombing. They didn't charge him with the Omagh bombing. They charged him with membership in the IRA, but they got the news media to say that that branch of the IRA was guilty of Omagh.
When you say that branch, so let's define the IRA, and both of you can jump in. You have the Irish Republican Army, and then you have supposedly offshoots, the Provos, Provisionals, the political arm, the Sinn Féin.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the IRA so we have a better understanding.
It has been around for about 90 years. Has brought about the freedom of the free part of Ireland, and will remain active until all of Ireland is free.
Okay.
But
so the IRA still exists?
Yes.
Okay.
I must say the part that's connected to Gerry Adams and this current agreement are now supporting British rule in Ireland. So they're no longer part of the tradition.
Now, when you say British rule in Ireland, you're talking about the 6 counties.
The occupied Ireland.
What is so-called Northern Ireland.
Yes, occupied Ireland. Yes.
Okay. Now, you say that Ed Buckley, this Patrick Ed Buckley, this FBI agent, is somehow connected to the Omagh bombings.
Yes.
How is that?
Through emails that were released under discovery.
That you found about in a Dublin court case?
Correct.
Okay.
There are emails there from the criminal to his MI5 handlers describing himself scouting the car bomb.
Okay, so how do you know they're the MI5? They're identified as MI5 handlers?
Yes.
By the way, the FBI and MI6 were operating in Ireland without the knowledge or permission of the Irish government.
Yes, in fact,
and that is known. That came out in court. That is known.
When all these crimes were going on, the whole idea was not to let the Irish government know they're there at all.
Because they were committing crimes there.
And so again, the FBI and MI5 both operating in Ireland. It's bizarre.
And Buckley was running a criminal named David Rupert from upstate New York who had come down here to Chicago. He was a serial criminal, tax evasion, owed over $1 million.
The New York State Police gave an affidavit to the court in Ireland that he was a lifelong criminal. But he was working for the FBI, had been working for the FBI for years. And
so are you claiming that either the FBI and or more particularly MI5 allowed the Omagh bombings to take place?
they created the Omagh bombing. They took what had been a Republican bomb and they used it to murder 29 people.
The IRA had been bombing several cities in Northern Ireland for several months.
They had just done 5,
and not
without a drop of blood,
without a single person dying. And their one way to bring an end to it was to ensure that people will die.
Now, the IRA, did they not have a policy? And just so you know, when I get the emails or the calls, I do not support bombing of any type or terrorism of any type.
That's why we're active, because we also are like you.
So if anybody calls me or emails me, the IRA policy, which was good, I believe, or was it not the policy? If somebody has different information, call the show, bring you on. Mr. Fogarty has debated other people on other issues. I haven't asked him, but I bet he would come back on to debate the issue.
Mm-hmm.
But did they not have the policy of calling beforehand?
Exactly.
And and they would evacuate even in I think the UK.
In this particular case, they did call. They made several calls, but somehow or another, these calls are not made available to the public.
And there's both a record of the calls, and there's a logbook of calls. Both of them are gone missing by the police.
And may I go back to something you said a minute ago when you talked about bombing? The majority of the bombings done in Northern Ireland was done by the British government and their surrogates, not the IRA, and that is an accepted fact. And we can provide documentation on it.
And when you talk about their surrogates, you're talking primarily about the Ulster Defence.
Correct.
And the various other hangers-ons and people they.
But you're right. You have it. The various Orange orders.
Yes.
Right. And the Orange were the immigrants of 400 years ago, or Calvinists,
or 80 years ago. You see, or 100 years ago, or 120 years ago.
Some of them are as recently as 80 or 100 years ago.
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's talk about now. There was a police report that was forged then that linked you to this murder. Is that correct?
No, it was a complete police report, and it was signed and dated, done under the direction of FBI agent Buckley, that framed me for those murders.
Who did the police report?
2 policemen, one by the name of, can you remember the name, Mary?
We have them at home. Fay. John Fay.
John Fay was one, and Keel, K-E-E-L, was the other.
Mm-hmm.
And they framed me for those murders. They put words in my mouth containing information that nobody but the murderer or the first investigator on the scene could possibly know.
Okay. And just for purposes of show, not to be offensive, it's your statement then as it is now that you had no association with these murders.
We never knew the people existed.
We might not have ever been in Winnetka in our lives, you see. She hadn't been, and I'm wondering if I ever drove through it maybe once, and I don't think I did.
Okay.
So that was that. But we didn't know, you see, they had never arrested us or me for those murders. It was in the course of the defense against the next set of FBI crimes against us that our lawyers received a phone call from we think it was from the Winnetka Police Department, saying, come and have a look at something. They went there, and anyway, they went to the Winnetka Police Department and were shown police reports, and they were given photocopies of police reports, which I have some of, I have the police, and that is what nailed me.
And who were your lawyers?
We were forced by the magistrate to, each of us, there were 4 of us, to get attorneys. For Mary, I got Professor David Thomas from IIT Kent Law School. For me, I got Pat Tuitt and his assistant.
Very good attorney.
Yeah, and because this was...
Although very expensive attorneys.
Exactly, but this was, they were doing their best to.
I know this was some time ago, but I bet you spent a lot of money on the defense.
Yes.
Now, is this speeding up a little bit, and then we'll go back to what it was. you have been completely, the charges were dropped, you've been completely exonerated of these crimes.
And they were not allowed to bring them back up again.
Well, of the second set of crime, but I was never even charged with the ones that were perpetrated by the
So
man.
you have no convictions at all?
None
No.
whatever.
Okay. Now, let's talk about this. You were in a bar upstairs talking about events with the Friends of Irish Freedom, and you do media watch and relations.
No, actually, we were in a private dwelling adjoining a bar.
Okay. And you were having a meeting.
Yes.
Right.
And in that meeting, and it was at the
Irish Wolfhound.
Wolfhound, which is at that time a well-known pub drinking
Yes,
establishment.
3734 North Milwaukee.
Right. And at the Irish Wolfhound, you are at a meeting, and there's a mole in this meeting, an FBI mole who's wearing a wire. Is that correct?
Another petty criminal from Boston.
A really misfortunate man who was suckered in by Buckley, threatened by Buckley to come.
Now, was he involved somehow in Irish political activities?
No.
No.
His father was trying to get. His father was also working for the MI5 in Boston and trying to get the local group branch of our Friends of Irish Freedom to get involved in guns. But the problem is he had a burglar son, and in order to get another son had run down two women. One was a nun, I think, with his car and killed them.
That's some real characters.
Yeah, and so to try and keep his sons out of prison, he was trying to come up with something under the demand of the FBI. And so they tried to get our branch in Boston to get guns.
Now, Boston was always a big center
Yeah.
of Irish and more particular IRA activity.
Yes.
So
I don't know that it had any IRA activity. If it
IRA support activity. yes.
support,
sympathy.
yes,
Sure.
yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In fact, a few times I've been to Boston, I've suggested people keep going, you're only halfway to America.
Well, along those lines, in terms of Boston, there were a lot of bars in Boston, New York, Chicago. I remember when I was a little boy, there was a bumper sticker, "Free Bobby Sands."
Yes.
That doesn't mean anybody was doing anything wrong, but people would pass a hat. I'm assuming most of the money went in the right direction.
Yes.
But it was kind of informal.
Yes.
None of it was linked that anybody knew to terrorism, although perhaps there was. And again, people can bring. I know there's been some discussion on this, but there were a lot of bars that were considered Irish unification or IRA sympathetic
Yes.
bars.
But see, all that falls down once a person learns that the terrorists are not Irish, they're British. And once you know that, then the collection of money for the Irish cause completely changes its character, doesn't it?
Okay, one small aside here, mentioning of Bobby Sands. The man that was subsequently charged with the Omagh bombing that Buckley set up had Rupert go
Buckley
over.
had nothing to do with them.
Well, that had Rupert go over to testify against him. That is, his name is Michael McKevitt, he's Bobby Sands' brother-in-law.
Yeah, so Bobby Sands' sister is married to this Michael McKevitt, who we tried to help out in his defense, but he was convicted.
Okay.
But Abdon Palish of the Sun-Times was doing a book for the FBI and for the criminal to describe his life as an undercover guy.
Evan Palish of the Sun-Times.
Correct.
The county
Yes,
reporter.
and
Who's part Irish.
yes, I understand so. But when it was found out about that book in Ireland, in the court while we were there, they asked the criminal, the FBI MI5 witness, about what he had said to the authors of the book. And this is hard to believe, but true. It was brought out in court that when Abdon Palish asked David Rupert, "Aren't you afraid with your given background that you might not have any credibility in the courtroom?" And Rupert answered, "It doesn't make any difference what I say or what the evidence is. The government has fixed the judges in the case." And there was no jury permitted. By the way, we were in the same courtroom. That was all occurred in the same courtroom where Robert Emmet was convicted and sentenced to be hung and decapitated in exactly 200 years within a few weeks. In 1803, he was sentenced to death in that very courtroom by an English Lord Norbury. And in that courtroom, the only difference between what happened in our presence to Michael McKevitt and to Robert Emmet 200 years ago, almost exactly, is that Robert Emmet had a jury. Under the current system, the Irish government, British you have to call it, don't trust the people to come up with the required convictions.
Well, let's talk about a couple other quick things. We don't have a lot of time left. You're alleging that evidence was doctored,
Yes.
that FBI agents perjured themselves.
By the way, that's standard practice, and they're not doing anything to correct it.
Okay. The bond amounts were high, and that even though they dropped the charges from you, that they indicated that through sound experts that tapes were tampered with.
They doctored the tapes.
Doctored the tapes. That has there been an effort to reimburse you of any of the costs?
No, and not alone that, we couldn't get a lawyer in America. Eventually, I was like Charlie Brown in the football, going home to Mary to tell her, I found the honest law firm. And she'd smile. And every time, this went on for 2 years. And then within 48 hours, usually 24 hours later, we'd get a call back saying, it's funny, we just learned that we have too much work, or this or that and the other. Some law firms or lawyers would tell us the truth, that this case was untouchable. Nothing can be done about these crimes so long as they were perpetrated by FBI agents.
And had Rebecca Palmer, a magistrate, not given us bail, we would have been in far more serious trouble.
There is one case, again, not to diverge too, where Manning, who was represented by Lovey and Lovey,
yes.
John Lovey, who was working with, we're not co-counsel on the consolidated cases, but fellow consuls on the Burge cases. And by the way, I get a lot of criticism. They say Burge is not Irish; it's a Norwegian name, and he was actually Orange. Just as a side note, because one of the gentlemen who defends you also defends Burge on the blogosphere and all that stuff. Burge, well, we're all human beings, so I don't care what race you are, whoever does what wrong. But John Burge is actually Norwegian, would be Berg, yeah. And he does have some Irish blood, but he was a Congregationalist, which is more than likely than not Irish as an Irish Catholic. But that's a whole nother show. There was a case recently where the Manning got $6 million, but then it was overturned.
I didn't know
by the judge's discretion, saying it was too much money, and now they're going to the Court of Appeals on it.
I see. When that first came out, the very day it came out, I gathered up my evidence. I took it over to Lovey and Lovey.
Yeah, we're very good attorneys.
Yes, that's my impression. And they just didn't get back to me. Okay. And I don't know why.
Well, I'm going to call John Lovey personally about your case. You know, we only got about a minute left. What I'd like you to do is, I know you have some websites and contact information. If there's somebody in there who believes in justice generally, as a universalist or whatever, or if there's some young, or doesn't matter if you're young, some Irish people out there who'd like to learn more about their heritage, if you could give your cultural information or your contact information and any last comments.
Telephone? Okay, email Fogarty, Fogarty, at ix.netcom.com, or call us at telephone number 312-664-7651. I'm in the telephone book under Chris Fogarty.
Okay, and that is on the screen as we speak. You also, a newspaper that you're associated with.
Yes, I do a column for the last 11 years for the Irish American News here in Chicago.
Okay.
Yes, it's been an honor and a privilege, and we do whatever good we can, whatever way we can.
Okay.
By the way, I think the statute of limitations cannot run out on this, because when I replied to Janet Reno, I said, if the entire Justice Department refuses to do justice here, surely we cannot consider that the statute of limitations is running.
Well, Chris Fogarty and Mary O'Sullivan, thank you very much for being on our show. We're going to have the second half of the show, so I'm not sure if they're going to do it in 2 parts when you watch it. It will also be on the internet. I want to thank you for watching, and stay tuned. And we're going to have more good stuff with Chris Fogarty and Mary O'Sullivan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And a battle drum was sounded straight and true, but the Angelus bell or the Liffey swell rang out in the foggy dew. Right proudly high over Dublin town they hung out a flag of war. 'Twas better to die